All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's lesson. Today we are continuing on from our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and looking at the human rights laws in Canada. So let's go ahead and get started. So really quickly before we do, we'll take a quick recap of our Canadian Charter of Rights that we have learned about, okay? So here is your recap here. We went into detail on your fundamental freedoms for Section 2. Section 3, we didn't get a chance to cover much, but it does talk about your right to vote, which we had mentioned in our initial slides. We then looked at our legal rights, Sections 7 through 12, so life, liberty, and security, the right to be secure against unreasonable search and seizure, the right to 9 to not be arbitrarily detained. We looked at 10 and 11 rights when you're under arrest or when you're being charged, and 12 being free of cruel and unusual punishment. And then we finished off yesterday with Section 15, your right to equality. And when we were looking at Section 15, specifically at the one case in it, we brought up this concept of human rights legislation. So let's jump right in. So what exactly is a human right? Okay, a human right involves a relationship between people. Okay, and we know that our charter, it has to do with our relationship between people and the government. So in the case yesterday, we saw that because an employee was fired from an organization that was not the government, he could not use the charter to call out that discrimination of his firing. Okay, so unless it is the government or a government agency that is discriminating against you, you cannot use the charter. And that is why there is a need for human rights legislation to reduce and help manage situations of discrimination that occur outside of a people and government relationship. So people and organizations and all the other aspects of our lives. Okay, so in our human rights legislation, okay, when we look at solving situations, what we are going to be looking at, very, very similar to our private laws, is a balance of probabilities. So unlike criminal law or situations with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, where there is a one right and a one wrong, in all of these situations, a lot of times it's hearsay, a lot of times it's one person versus another. So we are balancing those probabilities. We're going to hear from both sides. If it does go to court, the courts or mediation is going to hear from both sides, and they are going to make a decision based off of those probabilities, which one was more likely to happen. And then they are going to look at possible remedies for the purpose of solving the situation. So I had mentioned yesterday, it's not one person going to jail or anything like that. We're looking at making the situation better. So if it has to do with an organization, it might be changing their policies, providing education to people to help expose them to these discriminated groups, to help them learn from them and be more accepting in the future. It can go as far as using financial means if necessary to resolve the situation, but there's a lot more disposal in how we're going to go about doing it. We're not changing laws here. Okay, this is the law and it's helping people in situations of conflict. So before we can jump into the actual human rights law, we need to make sure that we understand three very important terms that are used very often in human rights. Unfortunately, in everyday language, a lot of people use these terms often incorrectly or often interchangeably. Okay, so I want to start by making sure that everybody is fully understanding what exactly these are. Okay, so the first one is a stereotype or stereotyping. Okay, a stereotype is a negative belief about an individual based solely on their membership with a group. Okay, so a stereotype is a belief. It's something that's in an individual's head. Okay, so, and it's based off of a group they are in. So you can know nothing about a person, but if you notice that they are female, if you notice that they are a teenager, if you notice that they are a certain race or a certain color, and you automatically in your head have an opinion about them, then that opinion is what is deemed to be a stereotype. Okay, so if people see teenagers and they go, oh, they're terrible drivers, okay, that is a stereotype. Okay. So in the example here, I kind of pushing you guys a little bit further, are both of these following statements stereotypes. So first one, if we say teenagers are poorer drivers than adults, okay, yes, this would be a stereotype, okay? There isn't facts to necessarily prove this, okay? And again, if it's specifically at a situation, you see a teenager and you're like, they're going to be a terrible driver. I know teenagers who are much better drivers than me, okay? This is a stereotype that we have. Another example would be that smokers are more likely to die young. This is not a stereotype because this is something that is true, okay? And it's not so much based off of somebody's membership in a group or an identity that we see, okay? So again, stereotyping is when you assign a characteristic to a person because of a group that they are in that is not based off of facts or evidence, okay? We next move to prejudice, okay? And I talk about move to because they really are a progression. So a stereotype is something that's going on in our head, okay? Prejudice, okay, is a negative attitude or feeling towards an individual based solely on their membership in a particular group, okay? So this is when you take a stereotype that you have about someone and you then have a very negative attitude or feeling towards someone because of it, okay? So for example, if you had a stereotype that women can't play baseball, okay, a prejudice would be being mad or upset that there are women that would want to play on your baseball team because you assume that they cannot play baseball because of a stereotype that you have. So it's taking something that's in your head and it's projecting it onto other people and having some sort of attitude or feeling there towards them. Okay. Again, you may not be verbalizing it at this point, but it is still a projection. Whereas discrimination, okay, is when you actually take this prejudice and you put it into action towards someone. So you actually say something to them about them, or you create policies in a business about it, or you exclude someone, or any other sort of action, outward action. So the first two are going on in our heads, okay? Discrimination is when there is an actual action put forward based off of your stereotype and prejudice that you have towards a person, okay? So not hiring a female for a job because you believe that women are not smart enough to be engineers would be an example of this, okay? So it is when you can't control the stereotypes and prejudice in your head and you do something about them and you put them into action, okay? Okay. So that is the difference between stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. And it's really, really important that we understand them. So I'm going to ask you now to pause this video and watch the video at the top of the screen here that's linked to make sure that you fully understand this example here. Okay. Okay. Welcome back. Hopefully that video was helpful. There is one more item that I just wanted to add, and it's a little bit blocked by my camera here, but at the bottom there's the term adverse discrimination. Okay. This is situations where people don't actively discriminate. Okay. But they have a practice in place that does actually discriminate. Okay, so here we're often seeing situations that are not intentional, but they're still based off of prejudice and stereotypings. Okay, so for example, there used to be a height requirement to be a police officer. Okay, you may say that this is not meant to be discrimination. Okay, this is just, we need police officers to be larger so that they can apprehend criminals. Okay, what people didn't realize is that this ended up discriminating specifically on female police officers because genetically women on average are shorter than taller police officers. Okay. And this would be considered adverse discrimination. Okay. So maybe a policy that doesn't, outwardly discriminate, but it is proven that it is affecting one particular group more than another. So even though you're not saying females can't be police officers, you're putting a policy in place that is restricting them more than another group, and that would still be considered discrimination. Okay. We've seen another situation like this with physical requirements to be firefighters, okay, needing to be able to run a certain distance in a certain amount of time. That was basically physically impossible for most females. And again, the argument was it's necessary for the job, but when we look at the statistics of it, it is actually a way to exclude, whether intentional or not, a certain gender or other things from that position. Okay, so continuing on, there's a few more connections and examples there for you to explore on your own to make sure that you are understanding. So when we look at these, our laws are against discrimination. Okay, we have no way of knowing what's going on in people's heads to know if they are stereotyping or if they do have prejudice. I will say right now that personally, everybody has stereotypes. Okay, we all have biases. Okay, we all have our own personal lived experience. So you don't need to say I don't have them. It's important that you acknowledge that you do have them and you don't let them turn into prejudice and discrimination. And you take time to educate yourself and to explore those stereotypes that we have been taught through the systems that we've grown up through. Okay, so let's look at some legal protections. Okay, so first we know the Charter protects us against discrimination from the government. Okay, we know that the categories that are used are fairly set in stone because our charter is very hard to change, but that there is a test in place, there's precedent that's set to include other categories, okay? Whereas our human rights legislation being laws, protects us from this unfair treatment or discrimination from other people and other organizations. Okay, you are currently protected by two pieces of legislation, the Canadian human rights legislation and the Ontario human rights legislation. Okay, as you can guess, the Canadian one is a Canada-wide legislation and the Ontario one is an Ontario-specific legislation. Okay, so again, when we look at different areas that are affected by different governments, they are going to be covered by the different legislation and codes that are in place. Okay, so if we look at the Ontario Human Rights Code, that's the law in Ontario, affectionately called the OHRC. Okay, this is what you would use when you live in the province of Ontario, when you work in the province of Ontario. If you feel that someone, your rights have been violated, okay, you could take a case to the Ontario Human Rights Code. Again, not violated by the government, violated by another individual. Okay, the code itself I have linked above, but we are going to explore it in a bit more detail in the next slides. Okay, just like in any other situation that has laws effect, the first stage is actually designed, sorry, this isn't like other ones, but the first stage is actually designed to try to keep cases out of our courts. Our court systems are very overwhelmed. They take a long time to get to court. And so it's set up in a way to try to have mediation, to try to have the two sides come to an agreement, to try to make sure that there's actually a case and we're not wasting the court's times and come to a conclusion. But if you don't like the result that you get, you can definitely appeal this and take it to a court. And it would be taken to your provincial courts and seen by a judge there. Okay, so what exactly is the Ontario Human Rights Code? Okay, what it does is it is a large code and it protects us from 17 grounds of discrimination. So if you remember back to your charter, there wasn't a whole lot of them listed there. Whereas on our Ontario Human Rights Code is constantly being updated and changed with all sorts of different areas of discrimination that meet the criteria. And they're included in this image on the right here. I'm sorry, my face is blocking some of them, but the majority of them are there for you. Okay. Discrimination based off of one of these criteria. So for example, being discriminated against because of my sex, because I'm female, being discriminated against because of my family status, being single or married, being discriminated against because of my gender identity. That cannot happen, and I am protected against that in 5 different areas of the law. Okay, the first is goods, services, and facilities. So anywhere that I go to receive goods and services, if I go to the mall, if I go to any organization or business, I am protected against being discriminated against. Okay, so that means that, you may have seen it in the news recently, that bakery that decided they weren't going to make a cake for a couple because it was a gay couple and they personally don't believe in homosexuality, that's a violation. Okay, any business that offers their services cannot discriminate against, they cannot choose not to serve people based off of one of these criteria on the right. Okay, facilities has to do with any sort of location you would go to. Okay, so again, if you're going to the swimming lessons, if you're going to any sort of buildings or location, parks, etc., again, you cannot be discriminated against. Okay, continuing on, you cannot be discriminated against in any form of contract that you are writing. Okay, no matter who the contract is for, you cannot be denied. You cannot have the contract changed based off of these. Number 3 is employment. You are protected in the process of getting a job, in the process of having a job, in the process of doing your job. You cannot be discriminated against based off of any of these criteria. If you feel that you are, you can make a claim against your employer with the Ontario Human Rights Code. Okay. Number 5 is accommodation. So this has to do with housing. Okay. So a landlord cannot deny your application and say you can't live in my building because they don't like your ethnic origin, or they don't agree with your sexual orientation, or any of the grounds for discrimination. Okay. Even though it's their building and they own it, if they're offering it as something that is available for rent, it has to be available to everybody. And number 5 is membership in unions. So again, a union, the teachers union, for example, couldn't say that, no, anybody that is under the age of 25 can't be in our union. Okay. You can't be discriminated against or treated differently because of any of these grounds. Okay, so the 5 areas are the types of business and the types of things that you're protected, and the 17 grounds are the areas that you can't be discriminated against for. So one thing I want to point out at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see that the OHRC, the Ontario Human Rights Code, the legislation that governs this, does take precedent over all other legislation unless it states that the code does not apply. So this is a really important consideration. If you remember when we were talking about the original Bill of Rights and how it is a piece of statute legislation, and so it sits at the same level as something else. And that's why it's really, really important that our charter is above it in the Constitution so that we are able to change laws, okay? We are okay with our human rights codes and legislations being at the statute level because generally it's not about laws discriminating, because that's covered in our charter. This is talking about individual organizations. But it is really, really important to note that what this is saying is that this takes precedence. So if there are other generally outdated laws that do exist that would allow something of discrimination to happen based on the way that they were originally written, what this legislation, when it came in, said that this takes precedent. So unless the legislation specifically states that for that particular legislation, the OHRC doesn't apply, this one will always take precedent. And legislation that would state that the OHRC doesn't apply would be very difficult to pass and would be something that the media would be really, really aware of. So it is very rare that that happens. Okay, so I now have a video for you to watch. This is actually from the training that all employees at the Waterloo Region School Board received, and I believe actually across Ontario, about the Human Rights Code. So it goes into a little bit more detail about this. So we're just going to watch it now.
The code opens with a preamble. This is an introduction that sets out the philosophy of the statute. The code's preamble states that it is public policy in Ontario that we can all live, work, and receive services with dignity, can contribute to society, and have equal access to opportunities without discrimination. The preamble also refers to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which reflects human rights values in Canada and around the world. Accommodation may include buying, selling, renting, or being evicted from an apartment, house, condominium, or commercial office. Depending on how long a guest is staying, a hotel could be a service or an accommodation, or both. This social area includes entry to the building, using swimming pools and the laundry room. For example, a landlord can't refuse to rent to a tenant who has young children or who is receiving public assistance or disability benefits. Services, goods, and facilities. Services and facilities include stores, restaurants and bars, hospitals and health services, schools, universities, and colleges, public places and facilities, such as community centers, public washrooms, libraries, malls and parks, municipal and provincial government services and programs, such as social assistance and benefits, and public transit. Also, services provided by insurance companies. Housing accommodation. Accommodation may include buying, selling, renting, or being evicted from an apartment, house, condominium, or commercial office. Depending on how long a guest is staying, a hotel could be a service or an accommodation, or both. This social area includes entry to the building, using swimming pools and the laundry room. For example, a landlord can't refuse to rent to a tenant who has young children or who is receiving public assistance or disability benefits. Contracts. Everyone has a right to enter into a contract on equal terms. This includes the offer, acceptance, price, or even rejection of a contract. Employment. Employment is interpreted broadly and covers everything from hiring to firing. Employment can include applying for a job, training, promotions, dismissal, overtime, rates of pay, vacations, benefits, discipline, and performance evaluations. The code can also apply to discrimination that takes place outside the workplace, but that has work-related consequences. For example, at an after-hours office party or on a business trip. This is called the extended workplace. Vocational associations. Everyone has a right to join and to be treated equally in unions, professional associations, or other vocational associations without discrimination based on the grounds set out in the code. Race and related grounds include race, ancestry, place of origin, color, ethnic origin, and citizenship. In some cases, racial discrimination is also based on creed. Creed includes religion. It may also include other belief systems that greatly influence a person's identity, worldview, and way of life. Gender identity is each person's internal sense of being a woman, a man, both, neither, or anywhere along the gender spectrum. Gender expression is how a person publicly expresses or presents their gender. This can include behavior and outward appearance, such as dress, hair, makeup, body language, and voice. Sexual orientation includes people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or heterosexual. Disability includes temporary and permanent disabilities, past or present disabilities, receiving or having received workplace safety and insurance board benefits. Disabilities can be physical, learning, developmental, or it can be mental health related, or drug and alcohol addictions. Disabilities can be visible, invisible, or perceived. Sex is generally considered to relate to someone's biological sex assignment at birth as male, female, or intersex. It also includes a person's gender, that is, expectations and stereotypes about behaviors, actions, and roles linked to being a man or a woman. The ground of sex includes pregnancy and breastfeeding. Age under the code refers to a person who is 18 years or older. Examples of age discrimination might be someone being forced to retire at age 65, or being denied housing because a landlord is looking for older tenants. People under the age of 18 are protected from discrimination based on other code grounds. For example, a child under age 18 could bring a claim under the code relating to sex, disability, or race. Parents or guardians can file applications on their behalf. Family status means being in a parent-child type of relationship and can include caring for children and older family members. Marital status includes being single, married, widowed, divorced, in a common law relationship, and same-sex or opposite-sex partnership. Receipt of public assistance applies only to discrimination in housing. It includes receiving social assistance benefits, disability benefits, old age security pensions, Canada Pension Plan benefits, and unemployment benefits. Record of offenses applies to employment only. Code protections apply if you have been convicted of a federal offense and have received a pardon, or have been convicted of a provincial offense, such as under the Highway Traffic Act.
All right, so hopefully that video gave you a better understanding of your grounds for discrimination and the different things that are protected with the Ontario Human Rights Codes. So continuing on, I did mention that there is a second legislation that exists, which is the Canadian Human Rights Act. So unlike the Ontario Human Rights Codes, the Canadian is Canada-wide. And it covers services, agencies, and organizations that are regulated by the federal government, okay? So businesses such as airlines and banks and postal services and broadcasting and media, things that are governed by the federal government, but are maybe not the actual federal government running the business, right? That need to be covered by a Canadian Human Rights Act, the legislation that exists as well. And these are generally businesses that exist across the country. And so it makes more sense for a consistent policy as opposed to each province, okay? So in this act, it has 13 grounds of discrimination. So we see a few less than in the Ontario Human Rights Code. However, it's more so just the type of categories. They've kind of lumped a few of them together. So most of the categories are still there, are still present, just worded slightly differently. So the same is true here. What discrimination actually is classified the exact same way. So which act you actually use, act or code you actually use, just depends on the type of business and the discrimination that is received. Okay, so if you were applying for a job at a bank, or if you were applying for a job with WestJet, an airline company, and you were discriminated against, it would be the Canadian Human Rights Act that you would use to file that complaint, as opposed to the Ontario one that you would use if you had been applying to a grocery store in town or another business in Ontario. So there is a link here at the bottom of the slide if you want to take a further look at their definition of discrimination, but it is in essence the same. Okay, so I have an article for you to read here. You can see the link up here that you can click, okay? And what we are looking at here is the concept of a bona fide job requirement, okay? So this, as you can see up here, this is a legal requirement. So if a business is going to have a legal requirement for the job, that legal requirement cannot be discriminatory. Okay, so a bona fide job requirement is something that is justified in having a requirement that would otherwise normally be perceived as discriminatory, but it is essential to the job. So the biggest example that I often give of this is with pilots. Okay, it is a bona fide job requirement of a pilot that they have a very good vision. Okay, they have a requirement, I don't know exactly what it is, maybe 20 or slightly less vision. Okay, which you would say that is discriminatory against people who are legally blind. Yes, it is. However, it has been deemed okay that that is part of the job requirement because it is deemed to be a bona fide job requirement. Okay. Just because something seems fairly obvious, you need to have this to do the job, the question does need to be asked if accommodations can be made. There are many jobs where normally people would say, nope, you got to be able to do this, you got to be able to do that, where with not a lot of effort and not a lot of cost, those would be able to be modified and shouldn't be bona fide job requirements. And oftentimes it takes somebody challenging them through the Ontario or Canadian human rights laws to determine if something is or not. In the case of the pilots, it is deemed to be a bona fide job requirement. There is not enough accommodations, excuse me, that can happen to allow someone with very poor vision to be able to do that job to the standard that it needs to be done at. Okay. Whereas other what was perceived to be bona fide job requirements have been tested and have proved to not be an actual requirement because there's different supports that can be put in place to allow this person to do their job. Okay. So I'd like you to read the article of the particular situation, and I would like you to discuss based off of your understanding of what discrimination is and based off of your understanding of what a bona fide job requirement is, if you believe that being friendly could be considered a bona fide job requirement. So go ahead and pause this video, fill this in, and then we will continue on. All right, so for our next activity, we are going to be looking at a number of specific cases, and we are going to be doing a little bit of an analysis to know that if this case happened to you, what exactly would you do about it? Okay, so I've given you a little chart on the right here, which I am covering, so let me move myself. Okay. To help us understand this, okay? So the first question that we're going to ask in any situation is what jurisdiction applies here, okay? Are we using the charter because we are challenging a government's decision, a government's actions, or a government's laws? Okay, are we using the Canadian Human Rights Act, okay, which covers services, agencies, and organizations regulated by the federal government, which I've given you a number of examples of, or are we using the Ontario Human Rights Code? Okay, and again, I've listed down the things that covers. Once you've determined which column you're in, which jurisdiction you're in, you then need to determine what grounds the discrimination is happening under. Okay, and you're going to use the ones available. So again, the Canadian Human Rights is different than what's available at the Ontario Human Rights, okay, and is different than what's available at the Charter. So you need to figure out what column you're in first and then go down. Okay, and then you are going to look at the consideration of if this could possibly be considered a bona fide job requirement, why or why not. Okay, and if not, then is it discrimination? Okay, that we are looking at. So the first one that we are going to do together, I've put a link here with a video. So I'd like you to pause this, go ahead and watch that video, and then we'll come back together and look at is this discrimination using the criteria that we just talked about. All right, so after taking a watch of that video, we are going to start by looking at our jurisdiction. So which of the three do we fall under? Are we looking at discrimination that's happening because of laws that exist? Nope. These are just policies at an establishment, okay? Are we looking at the Canadian Human Rights Act because this establishment where this is happening is something that is regulated by the federal government? No, we're not. So that means that we are looking at the Ontario Human Rights Code, okay? And if we look specifically at it, we would be looking at employment, okay? So in this situation, we are looking at this being a job requirement, okay? The clothing that the women at the job have to wear. And so this would fall not only under the Ontario Human Rights Code, but it does fall under one of the categories that is covered, which is employment. Okay, so we're going to follow this down and we're going to look at the different grounds that this could be under. So what grounds are these women being discriminated on? What group are they in that is causing the discrimination? Who's being discriminated? I already said it. It's women. So which category would that fall under? That would fall under sex. It has to do with their sex as being male or female. that they are being discriminated on. Okay, generally we're able to fairly easily pick out the grounds of discrimination by looking at who is and who isn't, and what is that category that puts them apart. So in this case, it's women, not men. The category that divides them is their sex. Okay, and then finally, is this a bona fide job requirement? Is it fair that this is something that is required of the job? Okay, right away in this case, you should see red flags when people, not everybody that works there has the same requirements. Okay, so the sexiness of the uniforms is not a requirement for the male staff. Okay, historically, it's been fairly acceptable that what clothes are part of a uniform are different for male and female, but the fact that the clothes are specifically sexy for women and not for men means that there is a difference between those two categories, and that is generally a very clear indication of discrimination. There is no reason, and actually the Ontario Human Rights Code now dictates that when describing dress codes, you cannot say men wear this and women wear this. Okay, it is one standard, and whatever you set that standard at, it has to be acceptable for both genders to wear that. Okay, so if you set out that, I remember one of my first jobs, I was told that men had to wear pants, but women could wear capris. Okay, that's unacceptable. When we could wear skirts that went down to the bottom of our knees. That's not acceptable anymore. Okay, if pants are allowed, anybody can wear pants. If capris are allowed, anybody wear capris. If skirts are allowed, anyone can wear skirts. Okay, it needs to be the same for either gender and for any other consideration. So this would not be considered a bona fide job requirement. It's not necessary for their job, and more specifically, it's not the same for everyone. Remember the example I gave, pilots? All pilots have to be able to see well. It doesn't matter about any of the other grounds that define them differently. Okay, that's a very clear requirement of a bona fide job requirement. Okay, so this is what you are going to be doing going forward. So your task, as I mentioned, for each of the cases on the following slides, okay, is to go through this and tell me which jurisdiction and which category, which grounds, and then, and you'll see here I have a chart, which key term applies. So you can use a bona fide job requirement if you think it is, or you can tell me you think it's direct discrimination, like the last case would have been, somebody is outright discriminating, or it is this, you can see at the bottom here, adverse effect discrimination, okay, which is where there's kind of subtle discrimination happening because of another rule that exists. Okay, I'm then going to ask you also for each of the cases that you look at to come up with one inquiry question. Okay, I've put a link here to help you come up with these, but one question that you want to ask to kind of challenge people's thinking regarding this issue, whether you agree with it or not, to help further the discussion. Okay, so as I said on each of the slides, you are going to see the link there. You're going to read it, watch it, whatever that is, and then you are going to go through and tell me which jurisdiction in the right column and put the information. So again, like I said here, you would write accommodation or employment. Okay, you're then going to, oops, sorry, wrong way. You're then going to tell me the grounds. You're going to tell me which key term applies, and you're going to write one inquiry question. Okay, so you're going to work through the next 4 slides. Okay, based off of this to determine if discrimination has happened and how you would go about challenging it. Okay, so go ahead and pause this video and you can come on back when you are done those. All right, welcome back. So your next task, I'm going to ask you to participate in a class-wide discussion with the students who are in school and who are not in school, and we are going to use the Google Classroom to do this. Okay, so if you go back into your Google Classroom, all right, so obviously tomorrow these will not be grayed out. These will be available to you, but you will notice that besides the link that you used for today, there is a question link. Okay, when you open that up, you will see the question. There's quite a bit of information, and there's actually a few articles for you to read about. And then there is a question that I would like you to answer. So please follow the instructions in the Google Classroom, consider the articles, take your time, and craft a well-responded answer. Also, as you respond, your classmates will be able to see responses, and you will be able to see your classmates' responses. And so I would ask you to consider replying to at least one or two of your classmates' posts to challenge them a little more, to continue the discussion, to disagree or agree, and help facilitate a stronger discussion between yourself and your classmates. Okay, so you can go ahead and pause the video and complete that now. All right, your next activity for today will also be found in the Google Classroom. So you may have noticed that today's link or today's task had both these slides that we are working through, as well as another document that has been assigned to you as an individual called the Human Rights Legislation in Canada Questions. Okay. When you open that up, you will see there is a document there with a little bit more information about the human rights legislation, and there are a number of questions for you to consider. So I would like you to take your time to go through the document to fully explain yourself, and when you are done, you will be turning that in with today's work as a task to be graded. Okay, so you can go ahead and get started on that. And I just want to remind you that, as always, you do have a review quiz to do today. Okay, so make sure to click on the link on the final slide to complete that quiz before you hand in the work. Okay, once you are done that final worksheet that we were talking about and your quiz, you could go ahead and submit your work for today. And any remaining time that you have before 1:50, you can use to be completing your Unit 1 assignment. So a reminder that that assignment is due by Sunday night. So this is your last remaining class time to be finishing that up. Make sure you use your feedback from your spanking activity if you had it submitted on time. Use those exemplars from that class. I believe it was the Friday that they're posted in, to make sure that you are completing a great assignment and getting it submitted on time. Okay, so use your time wisely, complete your work, and have a great weekend.